Since its release in 2014, the Raspberry Pi has been industry-changing. Who knows what computers would be like without it today? But since then, things have changed. Hi Pinkies! I feel that Raspberry Pi has been less in the cultural zeitgeist than ever before, and I kind of want to explore some of the reasons why. But we won't be able to find out anything just sitting around here. So join me as we go to the Raspberry Forest and figure out what happened to the Raspberry Pi.
Check out the storm damage. We've been having a lot of storms lately, but that is just crazy. So I don't usually do tech videos, but the writer's strike is making me be a little bit more creative with the kind of content that I'm doing. And something that's been on my mind a lot for the past, I don't know, my whole life, is the Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi is a credit card-sized computer that was marketed towards hobbyists and children, and it's something that connected with me when I was young to the point where, you know, it was such a good product, it convinced me to think I was a coder, technical person, which I'm really not, but it was this invention that helped me access that technical part of my brain. Now, the Raspberry Pi has sort of fallen out of grace, and it's not necessarily completely the fault of the Pi, but I think it'd be interesting to talk about what I think are some of the contributing factors of that. For reference, the Raspberry Pi was one of the most talked about computers for decades. For it to go from that to the state that it's currently in, a lot had to change. So to talk about the downfall of the Pi, we need to talk about what made it work to begin with. I really think that the Raspberry Pi, just like many other children's toys, is a trinket, and, you know, kids love trinkets. I don't know what it is about them, but the fact that it's just this tiny and you can do so many things on it makes it fun. When I first heard about the Raspberry Pi, I wanted it instantly, and when I got my hands on it, I found that there weren't a lot of projects that I actually loved to do with it, but I still liked having the device and the option to play with it and do all sorts of little things on it, even if I didn't have the money for it. Cool plugins, add-ons, and extensions for it. The fact that it's so easy to use, so versatile, and so small makes it really appealing to anybody, even if they've never touched a computer before and they're just, you know, a beginner. I found this old interview with the Raspberry Pi CEO where he's talking about engaging with kids instead of engaging with hobbyists because they already have the attention of hobbyists, but kids are the audience that the Raspberry Pi was designed for.
At this point, I think we always knew that we were going to see hobbyists being interested in it before we saw children. We are starting to see that interest, I think, from children. I think we've got to a point now where we've got more than 200,000 of them in the hands of kids.
I think if we look at the trajectory of the Pi up until the Pi 4, it has become further and further focused on the hobbyist market to the point that I don't think kids are really as interested in the Pi now as they were before. You could obviously blame any of this on the supply chain, and yes, it's a big deal. Raspberry Pi was in really high demand and continued to be in high demand throughout the supply chain shortage. I really got to start coming to the woods at a different time. But I would argue that the design of the Raspberry Pi has continually focused on the hobbyist community more than any other market. Instead of offering just one model, now there are multiple options with different RAM and storage options. There's different form factors and styles that you can buy the Pi in, and it's a lot more daunting now for a newcomer than it would have been back when I was a kid. Perhaps the most agreeable statement in favor of the Pi would be its affordability. For kids who can't afford a computer or don't have one that's available to them, the Raspberry Pi is only $35 and gets you an entire computer. Well, not necessarily. Even when the Raspberry Pi was just coming out, you still had to buy a keyboard, a mouse, an SD card for storage to even get started. And it's really raining now. Let alone a case for your Pi or any other accessory that you might want. Now, one could argue that the new options such as the Raspberry Pi 400 actually bridge this gap, because now, instead of just a blank microchip, you actually get a full computer. I think it has storage, and it comes with a keyboard pre-attached. While I see this argument, I also think that putting the Pi into a keyboard makes it much less desirable and much less fun to kids. Oh man, it's really raining. While the Raspberry Pi isn't a perfect computer, it never was, and I'm really excited to see what the Raspberry Pi 5 brings. You may have noticed my shirt. I have a Linux shirt on, and I am in fact a Linux person, and I don't think I ever would have been a Linux person without the Raspberry Pi. So for that, I do appreciate this computer, because not only is it a wonderful thing that I've had since I was a kid, but I still use it to this day. There's so many things you can do with it, and mine has been everything from a desktop computer, to a portable computer, to a handheld gaming device, to now a VPN to my home server. The Raspberry Pi truly is one of the few computers in my life that grew with me as I grew up. And for that, I hope that they can sort of figure out a way to connect with kids again when the new Raspberry Pi 5 comes out, hopefully next year. Now, I'm somebody who enjoys choices. Like, I remember when I was a kid and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle movie came out, I didn't like it, but I remember coming out of the theater and thinking, oh, it's so nice that people have an option besides Marvel or DC that they can go watch in a theater. I feel the same way about the new Raspberry Pis. There's a lot of different options for different creators. Now there's a smaller one, there's a bigger one, there's one that comes with 0 I/O so you can plug it into whatever you're using. This is great because instead of all these USB ports that were not necessary for some projects, you can just have a flat board. And as much as I don't like the design of the Raspberry Pi 400, I can see the appeal in some situations. Some kids don't want to handle just a microchip. They want to have the keyboard already pre-built. It's just a good plug-and-play solution. I don't know that taking these options away would help the Raspberry Pi ecosystem, but I think the argument could be made that these are only leading to more confusion for the new beginners. At least maybe make Raspberry Pi have one RAM option. It is a bit strange to offer a 2GB version of a Raspberry Pi in 2023 just because you want to keep that $35 price point. I think that the marketing was always really great because some je ne sais quoi about it made it have less of an entry to barrier than other companies like Banana Pi or Orange Pi or any of the other competitors that I've seen. Not to mention, all of those boards copied the form factor of the Pi. Maybe that's just to buy into the accessory market that was already really big for the Pi. Still, Raspberry Pi was doing something right. I really do believe that the beginning of the end for the Raspberry Pi was when the option for other operating systems came out. I don't think anybody was really pondering whether they should install Raspberry Pi OS or Ubuntu, but when Windows became an option, now that's a big deal. Why would I think that more options would be a bad thing for the Raspberry Pi? And I would like to call this the Apple effect. When Apple designed their first computer, they designed it to be very proprietary. You could only have the Apple OS installed on it. You could only plug in your keyboard and your mouse. The fact that Raspberry Pi only had one viable option for an operating system made it sort of a closed system, even though the Raspberry Pi is open source. You only really had one option. Options are a good thing technically. Now you have the option to install Windows or many different flavors of Linux, which is a great thing technically. But on a marketing level, I think it just confuses people. Again, I still think that most people these days buy a Raspberry Pi and install Raspberry Pi OS to it. So it's not the biggest deal in the world that these options exist, but it is one of those things that steps the Raspberry Pi away from beginners and towards hobbyists who are really technically proficient already. I like to think of Linux and open source software as sort of the family-owned business of the tech community. They're not out to make money, they're just doing something that helps the world in a genuine way. By making something open source, anyone can access it, and there's less weird stuff behind the scenes. You know for a fact when you install something on your system that it's not sending data to different people, that you can look at that software yourself and understand it. Now, I'm not a developer or anything, and myself, I can't look at the source code and understand what it's doing and what it isn't doing, but it's important to me that you can do that. So when Microsoft makes Windows available for the Raspberry Pi, it hurts my soul. I mean, the Raspberry Pi community, while it's not something that I totally fit into as a developer person, it was a creative and fun and inspiring community to be a part of. People would make handheld consoles that they could bring around their house. The Pi hole was an ingenious little way to plug in your Raspberry Pi to your Ethernet, and your entire network would have ads blocked on it. You wouldn't have to install an ad blocker on anything. For Microsoft to come in and just make Windows an option, so you could tinker around, you could do your own thing, or you could just take the easy way out, install Windows on it, get bored really fast, and then buy a Windows computer to game on. It's important for people to have the option to code, to have the resources available to make your own software, to read the source code of things, and to know your privacy isn't being exploited.
Hi again, Pinkies. So this is a segment that I've been thinking about doing for a long time, where I talk to some of my friends about identity and how they identify and just their experience in general with gender identity and sexuality and whatever. Today my friend Chase, aka That Gay Jedi, was gracious enough to answer some of my questions, and this is their responses. Please forgive my dyslexia. Hi, hello. It was over the pandemic that I really started to put the puzzle pieces together on the fact that I didn't feel like a man or a woman, but a third, worse thing, a Muppet. It was nice to have a core group of friends that I could talk about it with, because if I was just thinking about it to myself, it was hard to understand / self-validate. I definitely was aware of my queerness for much longer than my gender identity / non-binariness. That took a while to catch up to, and I think I needed an adult brain to figure that out. Everyone was, very luckily, supportive, but some made it a bigger deal than I wanted it to be. It's something that I'm proud of, but I claim it for me, not for others. So if someone doesn't get it, I really don't care. Those closest to me get it, and I love that. I hope this is at least a little bit helpful. That was helpful, Chase, and thank you so much for being the first person to do this with me. I really appreciate your responses and your genuinity in your answers.
As a non-binary person, I can totally relate to some of this stuff, especially just identifying and figuring out later in life. I also had those feelings of like, I don't belong here or here. Some clothes I like don't make anyone feel happy except me. And that's just a hard thing to get your head around. But I really appreciate your responses, and I hope that helps some of you Pinkies. And anyways, this is just a new segment that I wanted to try out, but I appreciate you listening and watching the whole video. So thank you so much. Bye, Pinkies!